Tom Wilson is a Juno Award-winning musician whose bands have included Junkhouse, Blackie and the Rodeo Kings, and most recently, Lee Harvey Osmond. He's also someone who grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, on the other side of the tracks, thinking he was someone who he ended up not being. He's now put all the pieces together in his new book, Beautiful Scars, Steeltown Secrets, Mohawk Skywalkers, and The Road Home. And Tom Wilson joins us now for more. Welcome.
Hey, how are you?
It's so nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too.
I don't think this set has had the amount of hair it has right now.
With you and I?
With you and I.
I know, we're fantastic.
I'm just saying. So before we get into your story, I want to remind people what you're best known for, and it's your music. Let's take a look.
These words that I wasted on you come back to me, baby, when I'm torn up and blue. Oh yeah, another day's through and I'm still loving you.
And that's you, Tom Wilson,
that is me.
of Blackie and the Rodeo Kings, performing I'm Still Loving You. Before I get more into your story, I'd like for you to read a passage from the book, if you could.
Yeah.
And then we can take it from there.
Okay. My name is Thomas George Lazar. I come from a family of Mohawk chiefs, peacemakers and peacekeepers, fighters and man-eaters, lacrosse magicians, tobacco salesmen, gangsters, shamans, shit disturbers, and survivors. But instead of growing up around these heroes and zeros, I grew up on the East Mountain of Hamilton, Ontario, the son of a blind war vet and a French-Canadian she-warrior. I am a living and breathing lie, an embarrassment, a married man's mistake, and a young girl's only chance to hop a fence out of town and escape to freedom. I was hidden from the world and from myself. My name was changed because it sounded too Indian, and my clothes were fitted to look like the other kids.
So how did Thomas George Lazar become Tom Wilson?
I was born at St. Joe's Hospital on June 9th. I was put into I guess a Catholic orphanage nursery, and then I was taken into a foster home on the East Mountain of Hamilton. And my grandfather, John Lazar, decided that he and his brother Sonny Lazar decided that this baby, me, wasn't going to grow up in a stranger's home outside of the family in the middle of a white community, that I was going to come home to Ganawage and be raised as a Mohawk proper. And when he came down to take me home, to take me out of the foster home and bring me back to Quebec, to Ganawage, my great aunt, Bunny Wilson, and her husband, George Wilson, stepped in and took me into their home. They put a blanket of secrecy around me, and it stayed that way for 53 years.
Because the whole time that you were with Bunny and George, you thought that they were your parents.
I thought they were my parents all my life. Now, at the age of 4, I questioned it. I questioned Bunny. Bunny was wildly loving, biggest heart I've ever met in my life. But she was also French-Canadian. She had the temperament of a scalded cat. And she was very, very dramatic woman. And when I said to her when I was 4 years old, how come you guys are older than the other parents on the street? And how come I don't look like you guys? To Bunny and George, Bunny said, there's things about you and secrets that I'll take to my grave. And she'd spin around on one foot, and she would go back to doing the dishes, you know.
And that was the end of it.
That was the end of it. And I mean, you got to picture her spinning around on one foot. She lived a lot of the time in the house in her underwear with an apron over that. That's how she walked around the house all summer long. That was the end of it, and that's how it was until I was 14 years old, and I stopped asking when I was 14 years old, because it was kind of driven home to me that a sacrifice had been made, and it was an unknown sacrifice, a sacrifice that most parents don't come up with. They don't come up with that kind of trip for their kids, you know. There was also a lack of maternal bonding that went on, that as much as Bunny and George Wilson loved me, as much as they gave me everything that they had to offer, there was still not that bond. You got to remember, George Wilson was blinded in the Second World War.
He was a vet?
He was a war vet. He was a war hero. He was my hero. And he was a tail gunner in a Lancaster bomber. And for those viewers out there that don't know what that means, the tail gunner seat in the Lancaster and Halifax bombers was a suicide seat in the Second World War. Most of the young boys that sat in that seat didn't make it home, but he made it home broken man, blind, and with a massive head injury.
But in your household too,
Yeah.
beyond Bunny and George, there was a third person in your house.
Yeah, my cousin Janie. My cousin Janie was kind of always, you know, she was always against one wall. She was always lurking, seemed to be in a corner. She was always a few steps away from the action. I likened her to the Ed McMahon, to Johnny Carson back on the old Tonight Show. She was always there in the room, but she wasn't really...
You didn't know what her role was.
Her role wasn't defined, you know what I mean? She was just always cousin Janie. And she was at my hockey games when I was a kid sometimes.
And when Bunny and George couldn't buy Christmas presents, she would buy the presents?
She'd come through, yeah. I mean, Christmas time was an interesting time in our home because, like I say, not only did I not feel that maternal bond, and I'm speaking, when I talk about this, I'm sure that there are thousands upon thousands of people out there that know they're adopted or are finding out that they're adopted, that know what that feeling's like not to have a maternal bond with the household that you're growing up in. So they tried their best, but I mean, it was almost like they were making it up. Like most parents, they make it up as they go along. But Bunny and George were quite older. They were late 40s, early 50s. So making it up as they went along was a little different. So Christmas was quite challenging for them financially and let's just say creatively also.
Or she would re-gift her stuff in the house for you to have presents under the tree, which I thought was really sweet. But how did being so unsure about your identity affect you over the course of your life, would you say?
Oh, it was, you know, it forced me to, push all the boundaries around me, challenge myself in ways that I didn't need to be challenged, and a real battle to find any kind of real intimacy and bond with any of the relationships that I had until I had my own kids.
Is that what, because you talk about being lonely, even though you were in a house with people that cared for you, would you say that's where it started?
Yeah, it started there for sure. I mean, these are people that had already fought this world. They had already taken on so many challenges. They took on, you know, the Depression, and poverty themselves, the Second World War, you know, coming home from war a little bit broken, you know.
What was it like for you as a kid to grow up in that space?
I felt like a spaceship had dropped me off in their backyard. I felt like I was not really a part of their world, even though they tried their best to make me feel at home. I still was. I was an only child. I was the only child in a household with older people.
And Bunny tried to get you to do different activities. You tell this great story of meeting Alan Stanley from the Toronto Maple Leafs back in the day. What happened that day?
Well, I was sent off to hockey school. Bunny and George, Bunny had cracked up some kind of deal with a guy named Frank Stukas, who's one of the famous Stukas brothers from the Toronto Argonauts. They won a Grey Cup back, I think, in the 40s or so. And she struck up some kind of deal and got me into this hockey camp. But she didn't really think about the hockey part of it. She sent me away with this old steamer trunk full of like shorts and socks and T-shirts, and you
basically stuff for the beach, right?
Stuff for hanging around, you know, stuff for hanging around at a camp, I guess. And I mean, you got to remember that everything back in the '60s for kids, you looked like kind of you came off a Mattel assembly line. Everything was like Hot Wheels pink, and you know, you looked like antifreeze and all these vibrant, crazy electric colors. And so that's how I went to hockey camp. She didn't send me with any hockey equipment. So when it came time to go do the skate around, to figure out what kind of skater you were, and I wasn't any kind of skater. I didn't have any skates, so I ended up on the ice in my socks and my sandals and a Chiquita Banana t-shirt and a pair of, you know, kind of electro flame, you know, spy man shorts, you know, running along. And
you were actually on the ice.
I was actually on the ice when everybody was skating around. But you know what? I talk about this and meeting Alan Stanley, who I didn't know. I only saw him on TV. And when you watched the Toronto Maple Leafs back in the '60s, you know, it was like usually, you know, on some kind of portable TV with a coat hanger stuck in the back and mostly fuzz and just little specks of hockey players. So I didn't really know what Alan Stanley looked like until he stopped me and asked me what the hell I was doing running around the ice. You know, in my beach wear, and he kind of took care of me, took me under his wing. But that was a challenge. For me, this book is by no means a sob story, but it is, you know, it kind of documents some of the challenges, some of the things that I'm proud of that 8-year-old kid, you know, that didn't let the fact that he didn't have skates or a stick or any hockey equipment stop him from
going onto the ice.
From going onto the ice, yeah.
So Bunny is this big, larger-than-life personality, but she also nurtured your love of music. How did she do that?
Well, she knew that I loved music, and there wasn't a lot of money around the household. Once again, George was war-blinded, so she found her way to the Zellers up on the corner of Upper Sherman and Mohawk up on that Hamilton Mountain, and she'd grab herself records. You know, she kind of run into Zellers.
She would grab like shoplift?
She would kind of, I don't even want to really use that term. I don't know if I use that term in the book, but I definitely don't want Bunny Wilson to be known as a shoplifter. But she definitely took records out of Zellers, and she would grab whatever she could. So she would like grab records and run out to her Austin Mini and drive home and come home, and I'd come home from school, you know, at lunch, and she'd say, "Which hand?" I'd say, "Oh, geez, Mom, give me the right hand." She'd pull out like Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, right? Yes. Black Sabbath's record, right? And I'd say, "Wow, thanks, Mom." She goes, "What about the other hand?" I'd say, "Okay, give me the other hand." It'd be like Frank the first Sinatra. Captain, yeah, Frank Sinatra, or the first Captain and Tennille record, right? It was like the two choices made no sense. So it was obvious she was grabbing, you know, what she could and running out the door. But this is the kind of sacrifice that these people made for me. It wasn't always, you know, shoplifting, but their hearts were definitely in the right place. I couldn't be asked to be loved any more than I was. I just was in the wrong place.
There's a line in the book, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but I thought it was such a powerful line. You said something about suicide being an invisible illness or something, to the point where it was just so perfect the way you said it, how, you know, when you are feeling suicidal, that people don't know what's happening with you. Did you ever
It's hard to watch. Something about watching a suicide.
Were you suicidal?
I think that I was slowly killing myself just by being self-indulgent. I mean, all of a sudden I had hits on the radio, and, you know, it's amazing how good looking you get when you put a gold record on your wall, you know? And the trappings of minor celebrity or whatever kind of stardom, Canadian stardom, 15 minutes of fame. Canadian version is about 7.5 minutes of fame. Whatever that was, kind of ate into something that it was a vehicle for me to be able to drive myself into the ditch.
And it was music that actually brought your life kind of full circle. How did you find out that Bunny and George weren't your parents? When did you definitively know?
5 years ago. 5 years ago, I was going on a speaking tour, and they give you a handler to get you to the airport and your hotel and things like that. And I got in the back of a limousine, and this woman who was my handler said, "This is great, I'm a fan, we're gonna have, you know," gave me the itinerary, and she goes, "I wanted to tell you that my grandmother was friends with your mother, Bunny." And I said, "You know, Bunny and George my mom and dad didn't have really any friends in Hamilton. The only relatives that ever came down to visit them were from Quebec." it was a shut down household. It was depressed to a certain extent, you know.
Do you think they did that intentionally?
Yeah, I think that they had kind of, God bless their souls, I think they kind of gave up. And they gave up while they had a young kid in the house. It's a weird thing to have happen for anyone who lives in a household with depression or that kind of sadness, you know. It's a very difficult environment. Anyways, her grandmother was friends with my mother, Bunny, and she goes, yes, in fact, they were so close that my grandmother was there the day you were adopted. And I was like, wow, I couldn't believe it. It was the first time I had heard it, and all of a sudden, all those times that I questioned Bunny about her and George being my parents, all those questions I had about why I looked different from the other kids in the neighborhood and why I looked nothing like Bunny and George, all those things, it's like came through years and years and years of fog. And it was the first time that I had some kind of confirmation that my doubts might actually be concrete. Even though I was mildly freaked out by that news finally arriving, something that you've always suspected coming to me. At the same time, I felt somewhat rejuvenated that I had to find out where I was from, who my mother and father were. And that started this 5-year journey that I'm actually on right now. I found out when I was 53, I'm 58 now. And through that time, I find out that that woman we were talking about earlier, my cousin, Cousin Janie, the matriarch of our family, she sits at the head of the table for Christmas and Thanksgiving, all the kids' birthdays. I was driving her home from one of the kids' birthdays, and I said, Janie, you know, I found out a couple of years ago that Mom and Dad weren't my mom and dad, and I know you're really close with them, and if you ever feel that you can share something with me about that, if you remember anything. And she just stopped me right there, and she says, Tom, she goes, I don't know how to tell you this, and I'm sorry, but I'm your mother. And that was really, that was the ton of bricks I think that I've been waiting for my whole life. And it hit me gently, and in that moment, I didn't think about myself at all. I just thought about protecting her, because I want you to understand that this is a woman who was now in her mid-70s, who had held this secret, who was made to believe that the mistakes she made could never be fixed, and that she was responsible for this secret in our family that everybody kept their lips sealed about. And I felt that she deserved a break, and I was worried about her. You gotta remember, she sits at the head of, like I said, at the head of our table with me, her son, with my kids, her grandchildren, and with my 2 grandsons, her great-grandchildren, and she never cracked.
But she wasn't allowed to be your mother. Well, you write this beautiful paragraph about that experience, and you write, Janie is my mother. I still call her Janie, and so do her grandchildren, Madeline and Thompson, and so do Madeline's boys, Janie's 2 great-grandsons. Janie and I both come from places where our options were limited. Janie comes from Ganawage, I come from Janie. We circled around one another for 56 years, never coming clean and never acknowledging the obvious. For 2 people to manage the situation is a full-time job. You've got to look the other way at exactly the right moment, or the other person will catch you being yourself. Mm-hmm. Being the son, being the mother, the effort took its toll on us both. Wow. What toll did it take on her?
I feel that she was, I feel that she took a beating. And she took a beating from the time I was taken away from her at St. Joseph's Hospital in
And the
Hamilton.
reason why you were taken away was because she was unwed and she was young.
Yeah, it was 1959, you know, and I was a Mohawk kid, and you know, people, you know, it wasn't an easy ride. It wasn't an easy ride for unwed mothers. It wasn't, wasn't an easy ride for unwed mothers who were Mohawk. You know, I mean, it was very judgmental. It was, you know, we were being ruled by, you know, by the crown and by the church, you know, and I think that those expectations were too great for the world around her to be able to say, you know what, be the mother.
Have you ever thought about what life would have been like if you had lived the life of Thomas George Lazar?
No, I never think about that. My life is been enriched by the people who have loved me and still love me, and the experiences that I've had. And I think that, you know, it's a little sci-fi for me to be thinking about what if and, you know, who I might have been. I'm happy with who I am. I'm surrounded by love, and I wouldn't challenge that or replace that.
You've done a DNA test, and it turns out that you have family in Ganawage. Have you met them?
Yeah, I met 5 of my 6 brothers and sisters. I grew up an only child. I met 5 of my 6 brothers and sisters 2 summers ago, and I still go back there. Not only that.
In Quebec?
Yeah, in Quebec. But I mentioned Sonny Lazar, and Sonny Lazar he was my great uncle. But there was something about Sonny Lazar that I considered him the legend since I was a kid, because the great stories that get passed on about families, you know, and that fuel our imagination and turn us into the people we are in my generation happened around the kitchen table. It happened over cups of coffee and cigarettes and bottles of whiskey and people playing cards and people talking about back home. And for me, back home around the kitchen table, you know, was Ganawage, Cognawaga, as it was known back then.
And you went there as a child, too?
I went there as a child for Christmases and went to my Uncle John and Aunt Isabel's house, who were actually my...
So Janie's family?
Yeah, that was actually my grandfather and my grandmother. But Uncle Sonny was somebody that he was an iron worker. He had 8 kids, and he was kind of the anchor to the Lazar family, I believe, my great uncle. The long road home, which I believe is one of the subtitles to the book, is the long road home. The journey home really for me was getting back to Ganawake on the reserve, knocking on Sonny Lazar's door, my cousin Sharon answering the door, and me walking in and coming face to face with Sonny Lazar, the man I knew as a legend, the man who was only a name around my kitchen table, these great stories about him were always around the kitchen table. And he got up from his chair with his walker and he put his arms around me. And for the first time in my life, I felt that blood on blood. And he said to me, he says, I wanted you. He wanted to raise me. He says, you would have been a great lacrosse player and you would have made lots of money in the cigarette business. And so I got to know Sonny over the last couple years. When I went back, I always went to visit Sonny. He was like a father figure to me in some ways. And I was flying to Montreal to do some press, in fact, for this book. And I had the limousine driver take me out to Ganawage. And Sonny was in the hospital there. And I went in to see him, and it was about 10 o'clock at night. And he woke up. I was sitting on his bed, and he says, Tom, he says, I'm so glad you came. I've been waiting for you. He said, now I can go and be with my wife, Hazel. And I said, oh, shut up, Sonny. You're not going to see Hazel yet. I said, I'm coming back. When I do, I'm bringing my grandsons, Hawksley and Levon. You're going to get a kick out of them. You're going to love this, so stick around. And we visited for about 45 minutes or so, and I got in the limousine. I went back to Montreal. I woke up the next day, and I got a call from my cousin that said that Sonny had a heart attack during the night, and he died that day.
My condolences.
So, thanks. But you know what? He gave me the gift of feeling blood on blood, which is something that a lot of people had tried to do in my life, but you know, they couldn't get there. That was my moment.
I know that you have a lot of respect for Bunny, and she's the only mother that you know knew growing up. But in those moments, do you ever have anger for her denying you that?
Oh my God, I wrote with anger. But this is part of the process. I joke that writing this book, Beautiful Scars, saved me hundreds of thousands of dollars in therapy, right? But the anger that I felt writing this book was transformed into love and patience and understanding. The anger that I felt, I was finally my heart broke open wide for these people. I mean, it gave me a better understanding, and I felt closer to Bunny and George maybe than I did while they were alive, you know, through writing about them and coming to terms with the fact that these people were the best people that I've ever known in my life.
Are you still lonely?
No, I'm not lonely. I got kids and grandkids and girlfriend. I got ex-wives and you know. No, I don't feel lonely. I feel a lot of love, which is part of finding this out 5 years ago. I was surrounded by love, and I mean, it's all we can ask for. All we can ask for is people who love us, who can give us a fighting chance in this world.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.